No one really knows how they did it, and the most disturbing thing is that we have been trying to figure it out for 2,000 years. The Roman Colosseum, a building that has been standing since the year 72 after Christ, which survived earthquakes, looting, centuries of abandonment and the weight of its own size. 100,000 tons of travertine, 80 arches, 4 floors of concrete and stone that even today make modern engineers scratch their heads and admit in a low voice that they do not fully understand how it was possible. Without hydraulic cranes, without structural steel, without calculation computers, without anything that we take for granted when we build something of that magnitude. And yet, there it is. What I'm going to tell you today is not the Colosseum of tourist guides. It is not the building from Instagram photos, nor the monument that appears on the €1 coin. It is the true story of how a group of human beings with their hands, their animals, and an organizational brutality that is still difficult to process, raised in less than 10 years the most ambitious entertainment structure that the ancient world had ever seen. And what you will discover in the next few minutes will change the way you look at that building forever. It all starts with a very cold political calculation. The year is 68 after Christ. Nero has just lost power. The man who had built a house so disproportionate and so obscene in size that the Romans called it the Domus Aurea. The Golden House has fallen, and Vespasian, the new emperor, understands something that politicians of all eras have always understood: to win over a people, you need to give them something. Something big. Something they can see, touch, feel. Something that makes them forget that they have just come out of 4 years of civil war and chaos. What Vespasian decides to build in the exact place where Nero had his private lake. That artificial lake that the previous emperor used for his own pleasure. It is the largest building ever intended for mass entertainment, open to everyone, free on many occasions. A political gesture so calculated that it is almost admirable in its cynicism. But there is a question that hovers above all that political narrative, a question that historians have been avoiding answering for centuries because the answer is uncomfortable. Who really built the Colosseum? The official answer says, Roman engineers, brilliant architects, an unprecedented organization. And that is true, but incomplete, because behind every block of travertine, which weighs between 2 and 3 tons, behind every perfectly calibrated arch, behind every cubic meter of Roman concrete, which the Romans themselves called opus caementicium, there is something that tourist brochures do not mention too much. Forced labor on a scale that is hard to imagine. After the destruction of the Temple of Jerusalem in the year 70, Titus, the son of Vespasian, returned to Rome with more than just military glory. He returned with between 70,000 and 100,000 Jewish prisoners, people, human beings who became in the Roman vocabulary construction instruments. It was they who dragged the travertine blocks from the Tivoli quarries 30 kilometers from Rome. It was they who excavated the foundations. It was they who carried the literal and physical weight of a building that 2,000 years later we visit with admiration and take pictures smiling. That does not erase architectural admiration. It just complicates it. And now comes the part that really has no easy explanation. If you want to join this community of people who seek the real history behind great monuments, subscribe now, because what comes in the next few minutes is exactly the type of detail that you do not find in any history manual. 30 kilometers. That is the distance between Rome and Tivoli, where the travertine quarries were. Imagine a block of limestone of 3 tons. You do not have heavy machinery. You do not have trucks. You have oxen. You have wooden sleds. You have rollers, and you have people who push. The geologists who have studied the Colosseum calculate that to raise the complete building, approximately 2.5 million tons of material were necessary. The travertine alone represents a huge fraction of that figure. The rest is volcanic tuff, fired brick, and that Roman concrete that deserves a separate story because it is literally one of the greatest engineering revolutions of all time. The modern concrete we use today has a well-known problem. It degrades, It cracks. Structural engineers themselves know that a conventional concrete building has a useful life of between 50 and 100 years before needing serious intervention. Roman concrete, 2,000 years later, in many cases is harder than the day it was mixed. Why? For decades, scientists had no clear answer. Then, in 2017, a team of researchers from the University of California analyzed samples from the Colosseum and other Roman structures and found something no one expected. The Roman concrete was made with volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius, seawater, and lime. And the chemical combination of those three elements, upon coming into contact with water over time, instead of weakening, it continued to crystallize, it continued to reinforce itself. Time did not destroy that concrete, it improved it. The Romans did not know molecular chemistry. They did not have laboratories. They probably arrived at that formula through centuries of trial and error, of observing what constructions held up and which ones did not, of learning from the failures of their predecessors. But the result is a technology that we, with everything we know, have still not managed to replicate in a completely satisfactory way. That should make us think something important about the difference between intelligence and information. But concrete is just part of the mystery. The other part, the one that really defies understanding, is the speed. The Colosseum was built in approximately 8 years. 8 years to raise a structure 50 meters high with an outer circumference of 527 meters. Capacity for between 50,000 and 80,000 spectators. 80 numbered entrances with public flow management systems that many modern stadiums have not surpassed in efficiency, and an underground system of tunnels. Elevators and trapdoors that allowed animals and gladiators to appear in the arena from under the ground, as if they were ghosts. How do you organize that with the technology of the year 70? The answer is that the Romans had developed something that engineering historians consider just as revolutionary as any of their materials. They had developed a construction site management system that would not be seen again in Europe until the 19th century. Division of labor, specialization by teams, planning in simultaneous phases. While one team excavated foundations, another prepared the travertine, another mixed concrete, another built the arches. They did not work in sequence. They worked in parallel like a factory 2,000 years before factories existed. And now is where this gets really weird. There is something in the foundations of the Colosseum that no Roman documented completely and that archaeologists discovered relatively recently. Under the arena, under that wooden floor on which the gladiators fought, there is a labyrinth, a network of corridors, rooms and shafts that went down at least 2 levels underground, 94 meters long, 73 meters wide, with a drainage system so well designed that modern engineers, when they excavated that area in the 20th century, found the water channels practically intact. What was all that for? Part of the answer is simple. For the animals, the lions, the tigers, the rhinoceroses, the hippopotamuses that appeared in the arena. They needed to be stored somewhere before the show. Specialists estimate that in a single day of games, up to 5,000 animals could be used. 5,000 in a single day. What that implies in terms of logistics, feeding, transport from Africa or Asia, is a global supply chain that made a stadium work. But there is another part of the answer that is darker and more fascinating. The basements of the Colosseum had 32 cages operated by a pulley system that allowed multiple trap doors to be opened simultaneously on the arena floor. Imagine sitting in the stands and seeing how suddenly, without warning, the floor opens in 8 different points at the same time and entire scenarios emerge. The difference between that and magic for a spectator of the 1st century must have been very difficult to explain. What comes now is what very few people know about the construction, and it is the detail that impacted me the most when I discovered it. The Romans did not use architectural plans in the modern sense. They did not have large format paper. They did not have scale systems like those used by an architect today. They used something called rules of proportion. Mathematical rules memorized and transmitted from master to apprentice that indicated how the different parts of a structure should relate to each other. If the arch measures this much, the column that supports it must measure a certain proportion. If the wall has such thickness, the foundations must have this depth. It was not intuition. It was applied mathematics without paper, and there is evidence that those rules were incredibly precise. Archaeologists have measured the 80 arches of the Colosseum and have found a millimeter consistency that is difficult to explain, even with modern measuring tools, and that can only be explained by an extraordinarily sophisticated system of knowledge transmission. The Colosseum took 8 years to be standing, but it took generations to know how to do it. I end with something that I personally find the most disturbing part of this whole story. In the year 443, an earthquake devastated southern Italy and caused serious damage to multiple structures in Rome. The Colosseum suffered damage to the south facade. What archaeologists discovered by studying that damage is that the area that collapsed was the one that had been rebuilt in later times with less rigorous techniques than the original ones. The part of the 1st century, the part built by those engineers and those prisoners, held up for 2,000 years. Earthquakes, medieval lootings in which blocks were literally torn from the building to be used in other constructions, centuries of abandonment, and the original core is still standing. There is a phrase that an Italian engineer said in an interview a few years ago that stuck with me. He said that if we built the Colosseum today with modern materials, it probably would not last 2,000 years. It probably would not last 500. That says a lot about what we call progress if you made it this far. It means that this type of history hooks you as much as it does me. Take a look at the other videos on the channel because there is more of this real history without embellishments, without condescension. Only the truth behind the things we think we know and that it turns out we have barely begun to understand. The Roman Colosseum has been looking at Rome for 2,000 years, and Rome has been looking at it for 2,000 years. There is something in that exchange that we have not yet finished deciphering.